triumphantly. Won't you hear to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever have, redemption songs, redemption songs. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, 'cause none of them can stop our profits while we stand aside and look. Ooh, some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the book. Won't you hear to sing these songs of freedom? 'Cause all I ever had.
The importance of the history of African peoples has never been more crucial for the development of the African mind than it is today, as we move into another decade, the last decade of the 20th century, because we have to now think in terms of preparing the African mind and the African world for the 21st century. So these next 10 years are crucial in how we are going to be defined as African peoples into the next century or two. And it is obvious that we, as Africans, have to lay that foundation for ourselves. It is most important and crucial, then, that we have the full grasp and understanding of our history, because it is in our history that our present condition and our future can be found. That history is an enormity. In fact, as Dr. Clark says, you can't have the history of the world without African history. African history is at the center of world history, and this becomes important as we prepare for the 21st century. If African history is at the center of world history, then obviously there cannot be a meaningful 21st century without African peoples. The question becomes, how do African peoples wish to have their presence manifested in the 21st century? Will it be as doormats of the human family, as people who have been relegated to a bottom rung, or will it be as the vanguard of the human family, preparing the human family to live together on the planet into the 21st century? Our basic intention has been, in the lectures that we have been presenting, and in the work that has been done by the First World Alliance, by our brothers and sisters in Brooklyn, at the House of the Lord, at the various other forums around New York and around the country, our basic approach has been that African peoples have to move into their African mind and start preparing themselves for the 21st century. This means that the European mind, which is impacted upon us, has to be seriously understood. And in understanding it and its impact, we have to deal with that basic concept that I have been talking about for these previous lectures, the concept of socialization. How you get your beliefs, your role models, your patterns of behavior, how you become what you're going to become. And if we're going to prepare true Africans for the 21st century, then their socialization process has to be an Africanized socialization process. So all of us, especially those who have been around like myself for 52 years, going on 53 in a couple of weeks, all of us have to be prepared to re-socialize into a full African dimension. So the history becomes important because it is the key to our correct and proper socialization. Socialization becomes important because without an understanding of who you are as an African, you're not prepared to operate around what I call the African VIP, African values, African interests, and African principles. So if we're going into the 21st century, we have to clearly outline what those values, interests, and principles are. Because as the European imposed his mind on us collectively as Africans, he imposed his values, he had us operating around his interests, and he has raised up his principles for which we are asked to die for. So as we map out this next decade to prepare for the 21st century, we have to outline an African world agenda. And that's what these lectures will help us prepare to do. First and foremost, in order to appreciate the full dimension of Africanness and African peoples, we need to have in our minds a timeline of African history. Because if we're dealing with the enormous presence of Africans, we have to understand the depth of that presence and its fullness and the projection for it in the future. So I have mapped out 10 major areas of conflict as we deal with the enormity of African history. And these 10 major areas of conflict are key and crucial for us to understanding how important it is for us to take control of our history. My new saying now as I greet Africans is Hotep. And as I leave them, it is take control. And I picked this up from some youngsters at Kane College in New Jersey who had prepared an African family celebration, and the young lady was reading her statement and she was saying that we need to take control. So as I leave my brothers and sisters, I don't say take care or take it easy. I say take control. And we as Africans have to take control of our history so that we can impact on our socialization and re-socialize ourselves. So the full dimensions of this have to be understood, and we're running headlong into the inherited bodies of European world experience that have been imposed as part of white supremacy on the globe. The timeline will help us clarify this. But as we get into the timeline, we will deal with 10 major areas of enormous conflict that we have to be prepared to struggle around. Those 10 areas are, number one, that we're dealing with an African origin of humankind. And when we're talking about an African origin, there is a great wealth of scientific material that has been presented, particularly over the last 20 years and particularly over the last 10, cementing for all who wish to know the truth that Africa is the origin of humankind, and Africans are the origin of that humanity. So if we're going to say, for example, as scholars are now saying, that there is no such thing as multiple races of humankind, I agree. As Dr. Diop and others would agree, that there is but one race of humankind, and that's the human race, and that race is African. Everything else is a offshot or a mutation off of the African. So that when we run into our history and deal with the Africans and civilization, we run, number one, headlong into the question of origin of humankind. And Dr. Diop and others, Dr. Ben and our other scholars, have established for us a scientific premise which we refer to as the monogenetic origin of humanity, the African monogenetic origin of humankind. We all come out of that African gene bank millions of years ago. But this article in Newsweek is very important because many scientific minds have accepted the African origin of humankind going back millions of years to that Great Lakes region of the continent, where the Great Lakes of the African watershed, the Congo River watershed, and the watershed coming from the mountains of Ethiopia and Tanzania, this Great Lakes region becomes the birthplace of humankind in this enormous geological development called Ogovai Gorge. Humankind marched down the Nile. And so, in establishing an African scientific presence of humanity, we have to be familiar with the African geography and African origins in the center of Africa. And we have to be familiar with what they call paleontology, the different evolutionary processes of the human species, the various hominids that developed, the man and woman-like early humankind. And what Dr. Diop and others have established is that the first 3 of the 6 early human beings never left Africa. The last 3 eventually left Africa and peopled other parts of the globe. The first 3 moved freely throughout the continent, into the south,